Hey, it's Heaven's Vault. Let's get into our second deep dive episode. Today I'd like to talk more about the best practices when it comes to dialogue, because we're seeing some things in this game that don't show up in other games. For example, this method of starting a conversation where it's just a random button that you hit. This is a really easy, fast way to allow the players to start a conversation rather than having it either start automatically or having to manually target someone to start a conversation. It detects that we're not moving and that we haven't done anything interesting for a while, so it gives us a conversation that we can have, and it picks via a heuristic. One of the other important factors here is the way that they will break or not break the player's control. So you can see most of that dialogue happened in this outlay, in this kind of screen, where I'm allowed to walk around. I wasn't because I was talking over the dialogue, but you can walk around and continue the patter. But whenever the dialogue thinks it's important that you focus on the dialogue in question, it can cut away to a short two-shot that shows these characters discussing it directly. That's an important feature that tells the player that it's time to pay attention. The dialogue is not just words that are coming out of people's mouths, it's connected to the presentation of the game. Another important factor there is the way that we get extra details when we finish up some dialogue. It hasn't happened in a couple of minutes, but it's just that black box that pops up in the corner and tells you something like, oh, you just learned that Six was born a few years ago. That sort of detail allows us to get a summary of what the characters in-game think that you are supposed to be aware of, what the characters in-game noticed, and that also serves as punctuation. So that means that it's a method of telling the player that conversation arc is complete. Please move on to the next thing. And that's a really, really valuable tool to help you create this really, really solid pacing for the dialogue, because the dialogue isn't just an arbitrary script coming out of someone's mouth. The dialogue is you grabbing the player and saying, okay, pay attention now, or, oh, don't pay attention yet, it's not really that important, or please pop up a tag in the side that tells you exactly what you learned so that you feel what the player feels, what the character feels. So the player and the character are connected via this chained awareness, this double awareness of what was important in that dialogue. Here you can see I still have control, so I can walk around, but I can also just stop and wait as we like. You also notice that the Q and the R at the bottom of the screen don't pop up at the exact same pace. One of them pops up first and the other one pops up second, and it's not always the same one. I think that that is a way to allow the devs to gauge investment. If the player immediately hits the one that pops up first, they're almost certainly going to be they're paying so much attention that they're on the ball. They're ready to hit that next button. Whereas if they wait for the other one to come up, they're a little bit less engaged. And this is another easy to duplicate best practice. If we did something like that in a lot of different games, we would have the ability to judge whether or not the player is paying attention, and whether or not they really want to move on with the conversation or they're letting it drift. That will really change the sorts of things you say, because if they're paying a lot of attention, then you can play it pretty fast and loose with context and subtext. But if they're not paying attention, you've got to be more explicit about describing what the situation is, what you're talking about, because they're not paying enough attention to get that subtext on the first try. That sort of detail may or may not be like absolute best practice, but I think that it is an important key into understanding that there are a lot of best practices that we haven't uncovered yet. There are things we can do to understand the state of the player's mind and to work with that state in order to make sure that the dialogue has a lot more punch. And I've already mentioned a couple of things you can do with that. You can do cutaways to close-ups. You can have summaries, little black boxes in the corner that pop up and describe what you and the character both have decided is important about this conversation. You can respond at different rates, or ask the player to respond at different rates, depending on how much attention they're paying. These are all important factors, and these are things which I find are not talked about very much. They're not talked about enough. When we talk about dialogue, we normally talk about what words to say, but it's just as important to know what things besides words we're saying. So here's our nerd. You can see that we did this close-up shot because we're supposed to be paying attention, this two-shot. And that is telling us that this is a relatively important little dialogue chain. This is character growth. This is character definition. And you notice that they pulled back to a three-shot just long enough to have that robot say its line and then cut back to the two-shot. This is a very well-scripted exchange. The dialogue itself may not be sparkling in this particular case, but the blocking, all of the stuff that we're seeing out of the camera and the way that these characters are being automatically controlled, because I'm not in control right now, that is all top-notch in terms of making sure the player understands the kind of conversation we're having and the kind of people that are talking and all that sort of stuff. And here we can see Huang Sao Renba on Iox. So that tells us that both we and the character need to know that. Now, in that case, it wasn't the end of the dialogue arc, because the dialogue arc unfolds however we want. These are not options that are like one and then the next and the next. They're just like a cluster of everything. But normally speaking, this game is all about the summaries at the end of events in order to tell you what was important. It happens that this is not the best example of that, but it's something that happens a lot, and it's a very good idea because the player is not paying as much attention as you think they are most of the time. Spoilers, it's something bad. Now, we could have talked to Huang in a way, or I think that was his name. I wasn't paying enough attention. But we could have talked to him in a much more personal way, but I was kind of splitting my attention and I missed the opportunity. If you talk to him in a personal way, you can hear him actually describe some backstory about the ancient legends, and that can be useful for having context later on. But I wasn't paying enough attention and I missed the opportunity. I clicked something else instead. So here you can see that we've got the Empress. We already discovered that this is either Emperor or Empress. And then we've got two words that we don't know, and you can see that they've got these here. The question is what these are going to be, and the obvious answer is that the Empress buried the robots, because we have been talking at great length to Six about how he was buried in a wall, how all robots are dug out of walls. I actually don't believe this is correct. I don't remember. It might have been banished robots or something similar. It might not even be robots, but I'm pretty sure that's robots. We're going to go ahead and go with it. It's been a while since I had to do that one, so I don't remember it. And you can see that there's a summary over there. So that's so low stakes that soft pacing minigame is so low stakes that it doesn't even bother to tell you whether you've got it right, which is why I was a little bit infuriated the first time I played, because I was like, I can't even tell if I got that right or wrong. But, it's close enough to right. So here is this timeline. And we've had things getting added to this timeline over the course of this episode and last episode. And in the previous episode, I talked about how this timeline is all of the dialogue preconditions. So because dialogue is stored as thousands of little snippets, it has preconditions that tell it when to run. And these are basically preconditions. But that's not entirely true. Not all of the preconditions are on this chart, and not everything on this chart is a precondition. There are things that don't have a time attached to them, just for starters. So how could they be on this chart? So because of that, you're going to see a little bit of divorce between the dialogue preconditions and this particular timeline. One of the ways to get around that is that you can have a discovery timeline instead of a time timeline. And if you were to pivot to that, you would see these things arranged not in the order that they happened in history, but in the order the player is likely to discover them. You can do that by just crawling through your dialogue snippets and seeing which one of them causes which preconditions, and that will allow you to quickly chain through and see which preconditions get unlocked. That's complicated a little bit by non-dialogue preconditions, such as going to a specific place or finding a specific object, but that too can be worked in if you have more than dialogue on your chart. But the point here that I'm kind of getting around to is that this timeline, while it's a powerful tool, as is, it's not 100% everything you need. There are other parts to your story that are not shown here on the timeline. And that's an important element. One of the things that's not shown is when you have dialogue that causes more dialogue. For example, I learned that 6 was buried here. Back here. There's 6. 6 was unburied sometime in this particular block of time. This is an important piece of dialogue, and we're going to talk more about that. In fact, we have talked more about that because this isn't my first take, and so you missed a couple of pieces of dialogue where we can talk to 6 about what it was like waking up. What does he remember? What doesn't he remember? All of those sorts of details. Those dialogue pieces have each other as preconditions. But those preconditions are also contextual. The game tries to juggle what the player is paying attention to, and if the player is paying attention to 6 awakening on Iox and seems content to continue paying attention to that, it will fork up the next piece of dialogue in that chain. If the player doesn't, then in a couple of hours, maybe they have a free moment, and we pop up that dialogue, but that dialogue is no longer hot. The player isn't aware of that context. So one of the things you can do is you can do a contextual reminder, which could be a piece of dialogue, like she says, "So, remember how we talked about," or it could be something in-game, like we show 6 wandering around, and it's like, oh, it's a great opportunity to talk to 6. And just by putting 6 on our mind, it's much less jarring when we talk about 6 as a topic. There are lots of ways to juggle how to do contexts, but the whole point of this entire engine, the whole point that I'm trying to get aware of here, the whole point that I would like to make more common, we're connecting the dialogue to the player's experience. And a big part of that is understanding the context in the player's mind. And if that context is in a good spot, you continue with that context. You push that context. You pull the character in deeper, the player in deeper. And if the player's context is not in a good spot, then you change it. It's going to be that sort of thing. So by using all of these techniques where we pop up summaries, where we have small dialogues, we have big dialogues, we have heavy, we have light dialogues, all of those things can be used to adjust the player's context. And we can think about this game, this entire dialogue system, as a way to track and understand interweaving contexts rather than a story. Now, there is still a story, but this open context system is woven together to create the story rather than a linear progression along the story. It's more like, say, a tabletop game where you sit down and the GM has a story planned out, but if it's a decent GM, it's not like, oh, first you must do A and then B and then C and then D. Instead, it's like the GM has some moving parts, some contexts, and they get woven together as the player moves through them. Same kind of idea. This is more like a tabletop game than a scripted play, if you see what I'm talking about. Now we're about to embark on our journey. I'm sure that I have plenty more to say about that. We'll get back to it later. I actually had a very brief conversation with the devs after they saw my previous video, where they actually mentioned that the whole system that I've been reverse engineering, they actually had a GDC talk where they explained everything I was reverse engineering, but GDC locked it up, so nobody can see it anymore. From what little I can see, I can be assured that everything I'm talking about is on purpose. These people didn't do it on accident like in some of the other games I've discussed. Mayorzi is a reoccurring little area. I actually really like that they've made Mayorzi such a central part of this game, because it's a nothing hick town. Now I'm being very cooperative. I'm following the plot as laid down rather than trying to fly off to other locations. And I'll probably continue being fairly cooperative with the plot. But just so you're aware, this game is fairly flexible because it's so context-driven instead of being driven by a linear progression. Let's go. So there is a quote-unquote action sequence where we fly along the rivers of space. And this is the first time when you realize that this game is set in a batshit world. This world is... calling it fantasy is a little bit of an understatement. This is not a fantasy world in like D&D sense. This is a fantasy world as in drug-addled 70s cartoons about science fiction. And I think that's great. We need way more inventive worlds like this. But one of the things that's important to realize is that this batshit world isn't just a batshit world for the sake. We'll wait for till she's done here.
It was a short sail through fast waters.
The batshit part of this universe isn't just random. These elements are in support of the story they're trying to tell. They're all analogous to elements of the story. This is a story about dreams and loops and lost memories, and that is exactly what this kind of feel has. This is a dreamlike experience. But the thing about it is that all of the actual dialogue we get is super concrete and uses all of those connective elements that we've talked about in the previous episode, which keeps the setting from feeling dreamlike. It just makes the setting feel amazing instead of dreamlike, and that is a really important tip. That's something like Oxenfree and the like didn't really get. Consortium, for example, they didn't really get that part right because their dialogue didn't make the world feel more concrete. It made the world feel less concrete. So even though those settings are less fantastic than Heaven's Vault, they feel more dreamlike and ephemeral. Heaven's Vault is dreamlike and ephemeral, but feels super concrete. I think that's wonderful. Notice that they wait until the dialogue is done before doing any sort of cutting away to the next scene, which is a wonderful touch. Not interrupting the dialogue is fairly important. As you can tell, by the way, I'm constantly interrupting it and talking over it. Now we could.
The ship
oh wait.
and into the mud.
By the way,
Mud covered the ground and rock.
Doesn't this remind you of
And everywhere I
Rogue
looked,
Galaxy?
things were
It reminds me of
growing
Rogue
from the mud.
Galaxy.
And some of those things had legs.
Here they are connecting to the world and to the other characters rather than telling us. I think that's great. The actual exposition dialogue was voice acted, whereas the connective dialogue wasn't because it was not as dull. Or not as on the nose, I should say. None of it was dull. All right, so we could go through all of Meerzi in this episode, but the actual conversation trees in Meerzi aren't going to be explaining any of the more advanced techniques that I want to talk about in terms of corralling contexts. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to end this episode here, and then the next episode will be a Meerzi episode, where we'll probably talk more about things like trigger volumes and conversation triggers and stuff like that, and layouts and so on and so forth, rather than the underlying dialogue engine. That's it for today. Have a good one.